So we are 10 days away from the season formerly known as Lent. I have not always been a fan of Lent. Growing up, all I knew about Lent was that my Catholic friends would all get drunk on Fat Tuesday and then wouldn't eat chocolate until Easter. That's about all I knew about it. In fact, when I went off to college, one of my friends asked me, "So what are you giving up for Lent?" And my sincere response was, "My Catholic beliefs." I've repented. I've since learned that there's more to Lent than Mardi Gras and giving up chocolate. It is one of the most ancient Christian practices of setting aside 40 days. Just as Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness, we set aside 40 days of fasting, repentance, to enter in, to remember Christ's suffering on our behalf, to journey with Jesus on his way to the cross, to see the reality of our own sinfulness and frailty, that if he doesn't die for me, I have no hope, that he is my hope. And to remember that our only hope is through suffering and death, through the cross. So the Wednesday after next will be Ash Wednesday, which marks traditionally the start of the season known as Lent. And traditionally, the priest, rector, pastor, depending on your brand of Christianity, would invite you to come forward, and then they would put a sign of the cross in ashes on your forehead. And they're not just making this up. This comes from the Bible. If you read Ezekiel, Revelation, you see that Christians are marked on their forehead with the sign of a cross. And as they do this, they then recite over you Genesis 3:19. "For dust you are, and to dust you will return." So whatever you think about Lent, you have to admit that this is probably something we need to pay attention to. That you don't even need to know Jesus to know that we have a problem. You and I have a problem. We're going to die. And given enough time, your spirit will be torn from your body. Your body will then be planted into the ground, and you will become fertilizer, and everyone is going to forget that you ever existed. The teacher of Ecclesiastes in the first 5 chapters, he graphically describes this, that the same thing that will happen to you will not just happen to you, but can and will happen to everything that you leave behind, to that business you built, to that fortune you saved, to that tree house you built, to that apple tree you planted, to that little girl and little boy that you raised. For dust you are, and to dust you will return. As an aside, if you're visiting with us for the first time this Sunday, special welcome to you. You've come to You're Going to Die Sunday. Yeah, that's great. Everything you do, build, create, write, love will end up on the dust pile of history. This world in its present form is passing away, the Apostle Paul says. Now, the modern world has created whole industries that are devoted to distracting us from this fact. In fact, 50 years ago, there was an anthropologist named Ernest Becker who wrote a famous book, won a Pulitzer Prize for it. It's called The Denial of Death. In it, he describes, his analysis is that in a modern secular age that has moved past, gotten over life after death, anything like that, death is just this horrific terror. There's nothing, it is the source of your deepest fears, deepest anxieties. So we do everything we can to avoid, deny, ignore, distract, numb. In fact, he would argue that basically everything we do, the world that we know it, that why we're so busy, why we're so passionate about politics, why we dress the way we do, everything we do really comes back to that fact. In the modern world, it's just the denial of death. That's what is driving us. Now, Becker wrote this 50 years ago when the world was still boring, guys. How much more is it true today? We live in a world that idolizes youth, a world that is really, really uncomfortable with talking about death, a world that has entire industries devoted, their sole purpose is to hide and sanitize death. Trillions of dollars are spent on avoiding, numbing, denying death, and yet the fact remains, you're going to die. So last month, I told you the story about John Conboy, who has that amazing story. He went up in the hot air balloon 2008. The basket caught on fire, miraculously survived, and then wrote a book about it called Jesus Was There, and tells the story of not just that, but all these moments across his life where Jesus was there. And I shared part of that story in my sermon, and then I received from John the best, it's probably my favorite sermon feedback email I've ever received. Now, the bar's not too high there, but so he was just honored that I had taken time to look at his book, share part of his story, and then he wrote to me, get this, he wrote this. I feel today is a memory never to be forgotten. And to make sure of that, I have entered it into my Apple calendar so that it will be there long after I'm gone. Yeah. This past Tuesday night, John fell. He was in pain, but thought he could sleep it off, so he made his way into bed, went to sleep, and never woke up. So please remember Carol in your prayers, his wife. Now, I heard that, and I was shocked. I was stunned, and I was hurt, and I was in the middle of preparing this message on death. I was studying how all of us must die, and we must face the reality of death, and still, I was shocked. In a book written shortly before his death, Terrence Nichols writes this, helpful. He says, people don't think about death and therefore don't prepare for it. It's easier to deny it. Why dwell on what you can't change? So people typically don't think about death until it's too late. They don't prepare to meet death. Rather, it runs into them like a truck. Now, historically, it was much, much harder to ignore death. It was really hard to ignore death because family members, they would die at home. You were the one who had to clean the body, dig the grave. Everyone was involved. Death was very much more common in your face. You couldn't avoid it. I recently read Gilead by Marilyn Robinson, which is really powerful in this topic. It's a fiction novel, but it's kind of set in this historic setting that a lot of the historical features are true and reflect reality there. And in it, it's the story set in the mid-1900s of this father who knows he's dying. And he's got a young son, and he knows he's going to die before his son ever gets of age. So he wants to share some of his life with him. So it's just this journal that the father writes to his son. That's what the book is. And in the journal, one of the stories that comes out is this tragic story about this little girl. She's just 3 years old, who was so poor she didn't have any shoes. She runs around barefoot, steps on this rusty old can, and dies from the infection. And the father reflects, mid-1900s at this point, but reflecting on an earlier day from the 1930s. He says, now they have penicillin and so many things are different. And then he says this line that just really caught me. He says, in those days, you could die of almost anything. Almost nothing. So in her work, Health Hazards in First Century Palestine, the Cambridge professor Rosemary Louf describes that in Jesus' day, 30% of babies never saw their third birthday. 30%. 48% of children never made it to the age of 18. Almost 1 in 2. In those days, you could die of almost anything. Almost nothing. So historically, Christians did not have the luxury of avoiding death. It was right there. So they didn't try to avoid or ignore or deny death. Instead, they remembered it. They remembered it. That's the word. In fact, there's this famous Latin phrase, memento mori, that Christians would say. In fact, it was an ancient greeting that people would give one another. I'm not making this up. Monks famously would say, brother, memento mori. And it translates like this. Brother, remember you must die. Say that to your friend next time you see him. Huh? Yeah. Now, this sounds awful to like our modern, secularly trained, death-denying ears, but today, the teacher of Ecclesiastes, he wants to retrain our ears. He wants to help us hear this greeting in the spirit with which it was given, a spirit of freedom, a spirit of life and wholeness and hope, not a spirit of fear and anxiety and dread. So when you came in, you received a miniature skull, and I can only imagine how strange that felt. You're like, wow, what kind of church did I show up in today? I assure you, we are a Christian church. So for now, I just want to invite you to do this. I want you to try and suspend judgment. Try to set aside fears and cultural biases that are begging you right now to ignore, avoid, deny. Try to hear what the teacher is saying on his own terms. Like, try to wrap your heart and mind around why Christians down through the ages wanted you to hear this. Remember, you must die. Why did they think that that was essential to living a life after Christ? Now, if at the end of this message you want to just hand this back or pitch it, I'll leave that between you and Jesus, okay? But for now, just suspend judgment. Our text for today is Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Ecclesiastes chapter 7. And at the end of Ecclesiastes chapter 6, the teacher asks what feels like a rhetorical question that's going to then pour into chapter 7. At the end of chapter 6, verse 12, he says this, "Who knows what is good for a person in life during these few meaningless days that they pass through like a shadow? Who knows what's good?" It sounds like it's like he's throwing his hands in the air and it's a rhetorical question. And yet, when we get to chapter 7, he seems to suggest, well, maybe if we're looking for answers to this question, maybe we can find it here. And it begins like this. "A good name is better than fine perfume." So far, are you following him here? This is, in Hebrew, this is a play on words. So a good name in Hebrew, Shem, is only like one letter different from fine perfume. So he's like, a good name, a good Shem is better than a good Shemin. Huh? So there's a play on words here, but it's not just, that's not where the similarity ends. He's not just making a word play. He's saying that both your name and the perfume or cologne you wear, they affect how others view you, how they receive you. They fill the room. Huh? You can detect them. So in the ancient Near East, perfumes were like the ultimate personal luxury item. You might remember Mark chapter 14, Mary breaks the alabaster jar, pours out the fine perfume on Jesus' feet. And the disciples, it says they are indignant. Why are they indignant? Because that's worth a year's worth of wages. This is crazy. You see, in the ancient world, they were extremely expensive. A lot of times, these fine perfumes were like heirlooms. Like you were waiting your whole life for just the right moment to use it, because once you opened it, you had to use the whole thing. So birth, death, marriage, it had to be the right moment. So the only people who regularly wore fine perfumes would be priests, who were on duty, because you had a special perfume that you were to wear when you entered fine perfume, when you entered into the presence of God. You were to smell holy, and no one else was to ever to smell like that, ever. If anyone else wore that perfume, literally, they were to be killed. And then there were kings. Kings and queens, they actually had the funds for this. So here's what the teacher's saying. You enter the room smelling like royalty, smelling like you just left the presence of God, right? If you buy the most expensive perfume in the world, you enter the room and everyone smells that, but who cares if your name stinks? Who cares if your character stinks? Who cares if people hate being around you? Who cares if everyone just feels anxious and nervous around you? Who cares if everyone's like walking on eggshells around you? Who cares if you got a bad name? Years ago, when we lived in that back house in Dallas that we talked about the other week, this horrific smell just appeared kind of out of nowhere near the front door of the main house. And after doing some research, discovered that a rat had died. And like this exterminator told us, well, two options. One, we tear out the wall, or two, you let nature take its course. So we were like stuck with this horrific, like drop you to your knees type of smell. And so the housekeeper decided to then try and mask it with lots and lots of air freshener, which kind of worked. But here's the thing. All that would actually do is if you drown that smell with air freshener is it would make you let your guard down. Like you'd be walking by and be like, oh, it smells like I'm walking through a field of lilacs. And then out of nowhere you'd be like, oh! What? You just can't cover dead rat, guys. That's the image. If your soul is rotten, if there are things festering and decaying inside of you, no amount of perfume can cover that up. Inner character is always more important than outward appearances. Inner character is always more important than outward appearances. And the teacher says, take note of this. Let this inform the job you take, the people you hang out with, the person you are becoming. Singles, are you listening? Now, I'm not saying that you have to date someone who's unattractive and unsuccessful. I'm not. But I am saying I do not care how sexy and successful they look on the outside. If their soul is not beautiful, I'm pleading with you, you do not want to be married to that person. Now that, to this point, makes perfect sense to me. Like, I get that. Okay. Good name is better than fine perfume. But then the teacher tacks on this. And the day of death, better than the day of birth. That doesn't make sense. So I've been there at the day of birth a couple times now. I've been there at the day of birth for some of your babies too. But for my babies in particular, the day of birth twice. I've been there. I've experienced the awe, the miracle. You hold your baby, this new life. There's a new whole person. Just, how did that happen? And you're holding them in your hands and you're crying and it's beautiful and it overwhelms you and your heart expands with a love you've never experienced before. Like, I've been there. And I've been at the day of death too. And I can tell you there are a million ways that the day of birth is better than the day of death. And the teacher, he knows this. He knows this. So in chapter 2, he's the one who pointed out death is a problem. It's a problem. It's this great wrecking ball of meaning, and he's telling us in the light of Genesis chapter 1 through 4. So he doesn't just mean physical death. He's talking about death. That the wages of sin is death. That when Adam and Eve sinned, they don't immediately die, but they are immediately, their relationship with God is ripped apart. It's the death of meaning. It's the death of true life. It's the attempt of humanity to find life, meaning, goodness apart from God. And that is not good. That's not better than it. That's terrible. So when he says that the day of death is better than the day of birth, it just sounds absurd. Like, are you kidding me? And some scholars think that's the point. This past fall, I went with a group of leaders down to Guatemala to visit Potter's House, exploring this ministry down there, about developing a partnership down there. And they have this ministry to the poorest of poor in Guatemala. Literally, their main site is right outside of the trash dump for Guatemala City. And most of the people that they serve actually make a living. They survive off of the trash itself. It's something. And so then one of the leaders, Mandy, walks us just down the block to their medical clinic, and we're exploring that. And it comes up there, hey, one of our members has actually been down here to serve at your medical clinic before, Dr. Dan Thomas. You know him? And she's like, Dan, we love Dan. In fact, she says, Dan's the reason why we now insist that every American always use a translator, always. I'm like, really? Do tell. And she's like, yeah, so Dan's a dentist. And so he was trying to just figure it out on his own, and he would have these little kids come sit in his dentist chair, and then he was supposed to say, morde, which means, with a D, it means bite. Morde. So he kept doing that to them. But he would mispronounce the word and say morte, which means death. So she said these little kids would come sit in his chair, and here's Dr. Dan leaning over them saying, death, death. They will never go to the dentist again. Yeah. Some scholars think that this is like that, except on purpose. That it's intentionally absurd, that the teacher is being, and I quote, this is one of the scholars says, he's being deliberately ludicrous. He's using language that's meant to shock you, to force you to ask, are you kidding? Is this a joke? Is something lost in translation here? But nothing's lost in translation. He's being deliberately ludicrous to make a point, to force you to ask questions that you wouldn't otherwise ask, to force you to notice things you wouldn't otherwise notice. So at this point, the only clue that he gives us is that death is better than birth, like a good name is better than fine perfume. These two are parallel here, which suggests that the day of birth is like fine perfume, in the sense that it is the day of birth is wonderful and exciting, superficial. Superficial. You see, on the day of birth, you might be celebrating a future saint, or someone who grows into a self-indulgent monster. You really do not know. Not on that day. The celebration doesn't actually tell you anything about the person, doesn't teach you anything about life itself. But the day of death, that's a different story. It's telling. On the day of death, the story's been told, the life has been lived, the person has become who they truly are. On the day of death, you see a person in a way that you simply cannot see them on the day of birth. On the day of death, everything that is superficial gets blown away. So when you are laying in a pine box, no one talks about how great your perfume is. No one talks about how expensive your watch is or that car you drove. No one talks about how sexy you looked in that dress. They talk about what kind of person you were. What kind of husband, father, mother, son, daughter, sibling, friend you were. That's what they talk about. They talk about whether you were present with people. Were you helpful? Did you serve? Did you love? So the day of death will tell you a lot more about how to live a good life than you will ever learn from the day of birth. The day of death will tell you a lot more about how to live a good life than the day of birth. So in that sense, the day of death is better because it's a better teacher. Now I want you to notice what the teacher's doing here. He's been doing this all the way through for the last 6 chapters here. We've called it negative theology, that he's subtracting things that don't make sense from life. We've called it a work of deconstruction, that he's tearing out anything that's not substantial. You cannot build your life on that. You got to tear away till you get to the bedrock. George Bernos describes what he's doing this way. He says, in order to be prepared to hope in what does not deceive, we must first lose hope in everything that does deceive. So the teacher here, he's trying to get you to lose hope in all the things that will deceive you. You cannot build your life on that. He's trying to destroy them. Don't put your hope in your work. Don't put your hope in how good you look or how good you smell. Don't put your hope in money. Don't put your hope in all these things that will just blow away. And he digs down, destroying everything that we put our hope in until he finally hits bedrock. And what is that bedrock? Death. Remember, you must die. You can build your life off of that truth. And when you hit that, you hit reality. And from there, you can begin to build meaning. So if your meaning in life cannot withstand your death, well, then it's not truly meaningful. If what you're doing today doesn't make sense on the day of your death, well, then it doesn't make sense. If you and I hope to find meaning in life, then we must begin with the end in mind. We must start with the day of death and then live life backwards. That's what he's saying. Verse 2. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting. Again, deliberately ludicrous here, guys. And the teacher, he knows it. So just last night, Jenny and I went with some friends, some of you, and we went over to someone's house, and we were eating good food, and we were laughing, and I played a game that I was just terrible at. Yes, we'll have to figure that out. But it was so good, right? And the teacher, he knows that that's good. He knows, he's told us, you can do nothing better than to eat and drink and receive these moments as a good gift from God. But then in the middle of that, he leans in and said, here's the deal though. When life is one big party, when you're laughing and eating and everything feels so good, nobody ever stops to ask, so what is the meaning of life? Nobody ever notices how quickly life is passing by. Nobody ever wonders, who am I becoming? No one ever asks, am I right with God? But in the house of mourning, at the memorial service of a friend, a neighbor, a spouse, a parent, there's no avoiding it. In the house of mourning, we remember the things that are most important. We ask questions that we might not normally ask questions that we usually would avoid. We ask questions like, man, did I tell my wife that I love her today? Does she know that I love her? Did I cherish my children? Was I generous or have I been greedy? Was I fully present with that person? Am I right with God? In the house of mourning, we get perspective on life. Suddenly the things that bother you so much just don't seem so important anymore. Suddenly that person that didn't seem so important to you, suddenly they do. Suddenly the thing you had to do, it's like on your mind, driving your life. Suddenly in the house of mourning, you don't have to do it. Those things that you've been ignoring, making time for people, being with God, helping others, serving others. Suddenly there's things that you've been putting off. Suddenly they seem really, really important. You feel like you can't put them off anymore. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting. For death is the destiny of everyone, and the living should take it to heart. He brings us into the house of mourning, into this scene where we're experiencing all of these questions, and he says this, don't miss this. Don't miss this. There is a love that can only be known and lost. There's a hope that only shines in grief. There's a beauty to life that can only be found in death. A few months ago, I heard the story of Clay Hobbs. Clay was a businessman. He was out traveling in Denver, Colorado. He was actually with his family. Got these horrific stomach pains. And decided he should better go to the ER, went to the ER, and found out he had advanced colon cancer. 90% of patients with this diagnosis would die within the first 5 years. At the time, he was 50. So he went through the treatment, and after 5 years, the doctors had run out of options. The cancer had spread to his lungs and his liver, so Clay decided to call it. He said he would do some minor treatment to improve his quality of life, but he was no longer even going to try and fight the cancer. Instead, he did calculations and determined, statistically speaking, that he had about a year to live. So he went ahead and picked the date. This is the date that I think I will die. It was January 31st, 2023. And he went ahead and labeled it. He said, that's my Ascension Day. And then he literally went back and numbered his days. This is how many days I have left. Now, he didn't know when he'd die. He hoped for more time. He prayed for a miracle. But he said when he numbered his days, it changed things. So over the course of that year, Clay was then interviewed multiple times for this podcast with his friend that I listened to. And he talked about how numbering his days made each day so much more precious. Like he hated it. He hated it when he wasted a day. And then suddenly how he spent his days became very, very different than he thought they would be. Like numbering his days did something to his desires. They simplified them. They purified him. So you want to hear how he wanted to spend the last days of his life? He really wanted to go to one more spring training, baseball spring training with his son. He wanted to take each one of his friends out for lunch, and he wanted to pay. And he just wanted to be with them. He just wanted to love them, be present with them. He wanted to hold his wife's hand and watch the sunset. He wanted to come to a worship service and just let the tears roll, just weep. Now the thing about this, there's no great bucket list here. Like he didn't need some great thing. It simplified his desires. These are simple things that you and I could do right now. But for some reason, we rarely carve out the time to do them. I listened to that and thought, I need to learn from Clay Hobbs. Because I am Clay Hobbs and you are too. Our days are numbered. We don't know the number, but they are numbered. Now I need to start living like it. For death is the destiny of everyone, and the living should take this to heart. Frustration is better than laughter because a sad face is good for the heart. The word frustration here is sometimes translated vexation, that it's not just being angry, but it's more like emotional duress. It's hardship, it's suffering. It's the type of thing that gives you a sad face. That we all seek happiness, fun, pleasure, good times, and we should. Those are good things. The teacher is not telling us not to do that. Those are gifts from God. But here, in this conversation about death, he reminds us, don't avoid the hard things. Don't avoid grief. Don't skip over hardship. Don't run away from pain. For a sad face is good for the heart. It's good for the heart. This hardship, this pain, this grief, it deepens your inner life. It'll grow you. This is where you encounter God, where you figure out who you are, who God is, what life is really about. 18 months ago, David Baba and I went out to a pastor's retreat in Portland, and that's where I first heard about Jerry Sitzer. Never met him before or heard of him, but he spoke at this conference, and really, I was super impacted by him. And so I was really curious when David Gibson, who wrote the book Living Life Backwards, has kind of become the basis for this series. A lot of you picked up that book. In chapter 6, he tells the story of Jerry Sitzer, the guy that I met this past, 18 months ago. And Gibson writes this: one night in the autumn of 1991, in rural Idaho, Gerald Sitzer was driving with his wife, his 4 children, and his mother when their car was struck by a drunk driver. And in a moment, he lost his wife, his mother, and his 4-year-old daughter. In the aftermath, Sitzer wrote a beautiful and profoundly moving book on loss and sorrow called A Grace Disguised. His reflections portray an unspeakable agony from the inside while powerfully describing how he and his surviving children slowly began to piece their lives back together again. Gibson then explains that in the second edition, just 8 years later, Sitzer describes how the raw and utter bewilderment had given way to, get this, contentment and deep gratitude. That he now sees how God used this redemptively in his family and the lives of so many others so that he can write this. This is a crazy quote. Sitzer says, "As strange as it may sound, I wish that every man could experience what I have, though without the acute suffering. I wish everyone could have what I had. That somehow God had used this horrific loss to, he describes it as, enlarge his soul, to expand his capacity to love God and others, to make him fully present, to give him freedom that he never would have had if he hadn't gone through this." And then he describes how there is a certain sickness of the soul that can, and I quote, can only be healed through suffering. There's a sickness of the soul that can only be healed through suffering. So I have to confess, I read that. And I prayed, Lord, if that is what it takes to experience the deep, rich fullness of life, please make me shallow. Please. And yet, I have to say, to a much lesser degree, I know that he's right. I've seen it in you. I've seen it in my life. Over the past 7 years, Jenny and I have experienced unprecedented hardship, suffering, and emotional duress. It sounds terrible. And it is. But God has not wasted a bit of it. Every hardship, every humiliation, every tear, he has used it to do something in us, to bring us to a greater place of contentment and peace and love and deeper gratitude. He's used it to heal us. And I've seen it in you too, 100 times over. 100 times over. Like, I don't want to suffer any more than you do. I don't want to be frustrated. I don't want to grieve. I don't want to have a sad face. But I can tell you, a sad face, it is good for the heart. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure. So get this. He's not trashing the house of pleasure. Go to the house of pleasure. Yes, there's good things to explore at the house of pleasure, but what he is saying is that when you're experiencing pain, if you go to the house of pleasure to numb yourself, to escape it, that's not going to help anything. Like, I'm no doctor, but I know that when you stop treating the illness or the disease and you just start treating the pain, things aren't going to go well, guys. If all we do is numb ourselves to the pain around us, we will never get better. So if there's nothing wrong, you go to the house of pleasure. Pleasure's good. It's a gift from God. But if we ever want to heal, if we hope to find any semblance of wholeness in this life, we cannot run from grief. So the ancient rabbis took this very, very seriously. In fact, they built it in. They worked it in, wove it into the ancient Jewish festival calendar. Get this. So Sukkot, which is the last and greatest feast of the year, the biggest celebration of the year, when everyone gathered together, they brought in all those like steaks and wine and partying, and it's like said they would sing and dance and laugh all night long. In the middle of that party, the 7-day blowout party, they would stop everything and they would read, "Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Everything is meaningless." They would read the entire book of Ecclesiastes as part of the liturgy, the tradition of the Feast of Tabernacles every single year. Now get this. They're not just trying to ruin the party here, guys. They're trying to give meaning to the party. If you've showed up to this party to escape your pain, you're in trouble. But if you receive this party as a good gift from God, if you're grounding it in reality, if you remember you must die, then maybe you can enjoy this in the way that is glorifying to God and good for you and good for others. It's better to heed the rebuke of a wise person than listen to the song of fools. Don't run away from the truth. Don't surround yourself with people who only tell you what you want to hear. Like the crackling of thorns under the pot, so is the laughter of fools. This too is meaningless. Have you ever thrown thorns into a fire? You know what they're talking about there? You throw them into like a bonfire. It's fun. You should do that. That's your homework. When you do, they crackle and pop. All right? It's like if you throw them in, they burn up quickly, and it's like little firecrackers. It's so much fun. Yeah. Teacher said, fools are like that. Their life is on fire, and you ask them, "How are you?" And they say, "Fine, good, busy." They pretend like everything is fine when their world is burning down. They pretend like their marriage is fine when their marriage is not fine. You ask them how they're doing, and they say, "Good, good." They act like everything is fine when they just had a panic attack last week, or they're ready to drop into depression. They experience a terrible loss, and then they numb themselves in a void and then pretend like, it's not a big deal. I'm okay. Their world is burning to the ground, but you ask them, "How are you?" "Fine. Good. Busy." But the wise person, when their world is burning down, and you ask them, how are you? They scream, I'm on fire! My world is burning down. They mourn. They enter into their pain. They recognize reality. So at the beginning of this, the teacher asks, who knows how to find a good life? And he doesn't quite tell us how to find a good life in this, but he does suggest how we might start. That if we want to find a good life, we have to clear away all the things that will not give us a good life. And we have to start with the end in mind. We have to live life backwards. We have to start with death. You must remember, you must die. That's where we must begin. Now, this is not just an ancient Jewish message that since the beginning, Christians, they've not avoided death. In fact, death has been kind of central to this whole thing called Christianity. Remember when Jesus was born, what happened to all the little boys in Bethlehem? They were slaughtered. He was born in the midst of massive death. He was the life in the midst of death. That's who he is. And then when he begins preaching his message about the gospel, the kingdom of God, what's his message? Blessed are those who mourn. And when the prophet Isaiah foresees this coming Messiah, how does he describe him? He's a man of sorrows. When he comes to Lazarus' tomb, what's the famous verse that describes who Jesus is, how he meets us in this life? Jesus wept. And how does this Jesus, this God-man, how does he save us? Well, he dies. Now, he doesn't just die on a cross. 3 days later, he does rise from the dead. But he truly dies. In fact, it's a central tenet of the Christian faith that his soul was ripped from his body and he descended to the dead. That is part of the most ancient belief of Christians, the Apostles' Creed. He descended that he truly died. That to follow Jesus is to follow Jesus to his death and then to resurrection. To his death and then to resurrection. It's come and die. That's the invitation. That we are to remember that life is short, death is coming. That is an inescapable part of the journey to resurrection. Resurrection is on the other side of death. And then this theme is then picked up in the early church. So the book of Revelation, chapter 6, John the Revelator, he sees this scene. And what does he see? He sees, and I quote, the souls of them who were slain. These Christians who've already been killed for their faith. And where are they? They are under the altar. So the earliest Christians, they took this image and they said, hey, let's do that. Let's remember that everything we're built upon is the death. We die, we're like a seed planted in the ground, and then we grow. That's where it goes. So they literally started doing this. You can go to churches all across Europe, and what's that funny box under the altar? That's a coffin. That's a dead man. That's bones. So churches since the beginning of time, have based their churches off of this literal interpretation of Revelation chapter 6, sometimes with a very creepy message that says, who I am, you shall soon be. Now, I've been in Christian catacombs in Rome and like 5 of the 10 oldest churches in the world, and I'm just telling you, this is everywhere. Everywhere. If you study the early Christians, you will find constant reminders that the Christian faith is not a faith that saves you from death. It's not. It's a faith that saves you through death. Through death. So as early as the late 100s, Christians began setting aside a period of time, annual period of time, where they would just remind each other of this. These 40 days, following the 40 days that Jesus was in the wilderness and tested and fasted, they would set aside 40 days leading up to the celebration of Easter. That death has been defeated, but the way you get there is through the cross, and we must come and die. So for 40 days, they would remind each other the season we know as Lent. That we're going to enter into this time. We're going to remember, Jesus died, I have to die too. I'm going to be like a seed planted in the ground, but then it's going to grow. Much fruit will bear from this. I can trust him even in death. And they had to remind each other year after year after year, remember, you must die. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return. And then down through the ages, this has just become part of the church and part of our history. You might remember, I give this as an example just because some of you might recognize this guy. This is St. Francis of Assisi reminding us, remember, you must die. And there's this whole period where they have these picture is called vanitas, which comes directly from the book of Ecclesiastes. These pictures that remind us life is short. Remember, you must die. Everywhere, all over you'll find it. My favorite picture is this. It's called The Ambassadors by Hans Holbein. You art history nerds remember this one. And so at first, it just looks like this portrait of these two very important men doing very important business, very important things in the world. And you look at it and you say, oh, there's something weird on the front of that. And you can't even tell what it is. But when you walk away from the picture and look back at the picture in the art museum, this is what you see. Oh, those two men think they're doing really important things that will last forever. Oh, but remember, they're dead now. You can only see it when you walk by and look back. They smelled really pretty with their fine perfume. Doesn't much matter now, does it? Throughout church history, there's all kinds of traditions built around this. The Benedictine monks have a tradition where they would have their cemetery or graveyard. You had to walk through it in order to enter into the house of prayer, in order to go to prayer. So every time you walk through, I'm walking through the brothers who went before me. This is my family. This is where I'm headed. And then they had the tradition that anytime one of them died, they would then dig the next grave. So there was literally an open grave that they had to walk by before they went to church. So they say, hey, that's where I'm headed. That one's for me. I tried to get them to do that this Sunday, but they're like, oh, that's not going to work, Paul. A risk or something, I don't know. Capuchin monks, the ones who famously gave the name to cappuccinos because they were brown on the bottom, white on the top, they take this a little too far, in my opinion. Like, you go visit their crypts, and it looks like a Tim Burton house party. I mean, I'm not joking. It's just like, whoa, okay, guys, let's calm down. But that's how they do it. Next time you're in Rome, check that out. The earliest monastic traditions down through the ages, desert fathers and desert monks, had a tradition of placing a human skull on the desk where they would pray and study and read God's word. So that every time they sat down to do that work, they would be reminded, remember, you're going to die. Life is short. Now, this was not just a Catholic thing. The Puritans, they fully embrace this. Protestant Puritans, American Protestant Puritans. So when you tuck your little kids into bed at night, I don't know what your bedtime routine is like. Do a bath, play some games, watch a little video. And then you lay, okay, time to say our prayers. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. You might die tonight. Good night. Love you. I'm not joking. They prepared their children for death because many of them did die. Jonathan Edwards, one of my favorite pastor theologians from the 1700s, he had these 70 resolutions that he would read and reread every week to recommit his life to the Lord. And number 9 read like this: resolved to think much on all occasions about my own dying and of the common circumstances to which attend death. I want to think about that every single week. I want to recommit myself to that every single week. Now, I'm suggesting what I'm betting no pastor has ever suggested to you before, but should have. That as we head into the season of Lent, I want to invite you to remember you must die. Why? Because it's true. It's true. It's reality. Like, if your meaning in life can't withstand that, it's not meaningful. If what you're doing today doesn't make sense in light of that, then it doesn't make sense. This should shape our lives. I want you to do it because when we number our days, we value things differently. It sets us free from all these little things that we worry about that we think are so important, but aren't. And suddenly, the things that we don't value, sometimes they seem really valuable, really important. It changes our values. Why do we need to do this? Because it teaches us not to run from hardship and grief, because blessed are those who mourn. That the salvation we're looking for, the resurrection we long for, is not found by avoiding suffering. It's not found from death, it's found through death. Now, if you suffered a recent loss, or you struggle with anxiety or depression, this might not be the season for you to dive into this, and please don't feel any pressure to be part of this. But if you are just at, fine, busy, good, that. Like most of us are. Fine, busy, good. If you're somewhere in that range, this is why we gave you this miniature skull. I'm going to invite you to take it and place it in some place where, just for you, obviously don't weird people out with it. Some place that you regularly look, so that every time you see it, leading up between now and Easter, you are reminded, I'm going to die. And I have to stand before my Lord. Am I living like that? Am I living like my days are numbered? Am I ready? Am I prepared for this? Again, this is totally optional. If that weirds you out, you do you. If it raises in you fear, anxiety, worries, if you realize that I don't know how I'm living makes sense in light of my death, pay attention to that. Pay attention to that. This is our opportunity to press into it, because our only hope in life and death, the first question of the catechism we teach our children over here, what is your only hope in life and death? What is your only hope in life and death? That we belong to God. If Jesus didn't die for me and rise from the dead, if I don't belong to him so that I know that I'm one with him, then I have no hope. Then death is the end. Then this is terrible. Then I should be afraid. But if I am united with him, then I can surrender to him. I can receive this day as a good gift, and I can live in the power of the Holy Spirit. Now, if these questions, am I prepared to meet God? Am I prepared to die? If your answer is a hard no, let me just share with you, you can't outrun death. Someday it's going to hit you like a truck. And you can be prepared. But you have to give up control. You have to surrender to the one who's already defeated death on your behalf. I pray that you do that, because your days are numbered. Father, I pray that you be gracious to us. I pray for those who are grieving right now, that you be a comforter to them, that you be gentle with them. And God, to those of us who are comfortable, I pray that we would be discomforted. I pray that we would mourn. God, you know what we need. So we trust you with ourselves, and we trust you with this time. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.